Zayden was 68 when it happened. He had been sitting in his favorite chair by the window, sipping tea as the late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains. It was an ordinary moment, one of those quiet pauses in life he cherished, but in an instant, something felt wrong. His hand trembled, the cup rattled against its saucer, and a strange heaviness spread across his face. He tried to speak, to call out for help, but the words caught in his throat, twisted, broken, unrecognizable even to his own ears. Alone in the house, the silence around him felt heavier than ever. I've seen moments like this more times than I'd like to admit. As a doctor who has cared for people his age for decades, I know that strokes never ask permission. They come without warning, stealing strength and speech in seconds. The hardest part is not always the pain, it's the confusion, the fear, the desperate realization that your body is betraying you when you least expect it. For Zayden, those first minutes felt endless. His heart raced, his thoughts blurred, yet deep inside, he knew one thing. He had to act, and he had to act quickly. You see, Zayden had always been independent. A retired history teacher, he had spent years guiding students through stories of resilience and survival. He was a widower now, his children scattered across different cities, each living lives of their own. His neighbors checked in from time to time, but most days it was just him and the ticking of the clock. For someone like Zayden, the idea of a sudden health crisis had always lingered in the back of his mind, but he had pushed it away with the quiet stubbornness of age. That day, however, the fear became real. What makes this story powerful is not just the danger he faced, but the choices he made in the moments that followed. With one side of his face slack and his speech faltering, he still managed to focus on the lessons his doctor had shared years earlier. He remembered the importance of checking himself, of looking in the mirror, of noticing the unevenness in his smile. He pressed the emergency button on his phone, his voice slurred but determined. He unlocked the front door, cleared the hallway as best he could, and then lay down carefully on his side, fighting to stay awake, whispering the time to himself so he wouldn't forget when the symptoms began. When I tell you about Zayden, I want you to picture not just an old man fighting for survival, but a mirror of yourself, your father, your mother, or someone you love. Because strokes don't arrive with warnings, and they don't wait until someone is nearby to help. They strike when you're alone in the kitchen, when you're driving home from the market, when you're folding laundry in the quiet of your bedroom. And in those moments, knowledge is not just power, it is life. The truth is, what saved Zayden was not luck, but preparation. He had listened, he had remembered, and he had acted when it mattered most. Later, when I saw him in the hospital, his face pale but his eyes steady, he told me he never thought he would be strong enough to fight back. Yet he did, and that fight, those small but crucial decisions, gave him the chance to recover, to tell his story, to remind others that survival is possible, even when no one is around. That's what I want to share with you today. The steps, the choices, the mindset that can mean the difference between tragedy and a second chance. Zayden's story is not just his own, it is a lesson for every one of us who lives with the quiet risk of tomorrow. Zayden never thought much about his health. At 68, his days moved with quiet predictability. He woke early, made tea, and sat by the window where the light poured in like an old friend. He had aches in his knees from years of teaching and long walks across campus, but he considered them souvenirs of a life well lived. In his heart, he believed as long as he ate simply, stayed calm, and avoided too much trouble, his body would take care of him. That faith was shaken the afternoon his hand slipped, the tea spilling across his lap as his face turned strangely heavy. The strange thing about a stroke is that it rarely feels like the movies. There is no dramatic collapse, no sudden scream for help. Instead, there's confusion, a subtle betrayal of the body that makes you question whether it's real. For Zayden, the hardest part wasn't the weakness in his arm, but the fog in his mind, the quiet voice telling him it might pass, that maybe it was nothing. This denial is something I've seen countless times as a doctor. People convince themselves to wait to see if it improves. But strokes rarely get better on their own. In fact, with every passing minute, brain cells are lost forever. As he sat there, fighting against disbelief, Zayden remembered a conversation we had years earlier. He had come in for a routine checkup, his blood pressure slightly higher than normal. I had warned him then, Zayden, high blood pressure is the silent enemy. It's the single most important risk factor for stroke, yet most people ignore it because it doesn't hurt. He had nodded politely at the time, the way people do when they don't think danger is close. But now, with his arm drifting lower and his mouth failing to form words, my warning echoed through his mind like a bell. This was the first turning point in Zayden's journey, the shift from denial to recognition. He forced himself to act, to check what was happening. He reached for the small mirror on his coffee table, tilted it, and tried to smile. One side of his mouth hung lower, unresponsive. His heart sank. Then he lifted both arms, holding them in the air. One obeyed, the other drifted downward like a leaf in slow motion. He whispered a sentence, but the words spilled out slurred, tangled, broken. In that instant, he knew this was no ordinary moment. He was having a stroke. The courage it took to admit that truth cannot be underestimated. Most people, especially men his age, cling to pride, to the idea of waiting it out. But recognition was Zayden's first victory. He was no longer a passive victim of the moment. He was an active fighter. That shift in awareness gave him the clarity to move toward the next step, survival. And in that moment, though he was alone, he was not helpless. He had knowledge, and knowledge became his lifeline. When I tell his story, I want you to feel what he felt. The loneliness of the room, the silence pressing in, and then the flicker of determination breaking through the fog. Zayden understood that admitting he was in danger was the key that opened the door to survival. Without that, all the advice in the world would mean nothing. So his journey began with awareness, a simple but profound truth. When your body sends a warning, listen. Even if it's quiet, even if you want to dismiss it, listen, because every second is a choice between denial and life. The phone lay on the table just a few feet away, but for Zayden, it felt like miles. His arm trembled as he reached for it, his fingers clumsy and slow. He pressed the screen, fumbling with the buttons, his vision slightly blurred. Panic rose in his chest, that old instinct to shout for someone, anyone, but the house answered with silence. It was in that silence he realized how alone he truly was. His children weren't there, his neighbors couldn't hear him, and for the first time in years, the weight of living alone felt suffocating. Yet in that moment of fear, he remembered something I had told him before. If you ever feel stroke symptoms, don't waste time debating. Call for help. The words returned with surprising clarity, guiding him like a rope in the dark. He activated the emergency shortcut on his phone. His voice was slurred, his words broken, but the dispatcher understood enough. Stroke, he managed to say, and though the syllables were rough, they carried everything that mattered. This decision, picking up the phone instead of waiting, was the second turning point. For many, pride or hesitation becomes a silent killer. They don't want to trouble anyone, they hope it will pass. But Zayden's courage lay in admitting he could not do this alone. He placed his trust in strangers on the other end of the line, and that trust was the lifeline that kept him moving forward. What few realize is that calling emergency services isn't just about transportation, it's about timing. Every hospital can treat a stroke, but not every hospital has the same resources. Stroke centers are equipped with clot-busting medications, advanced scans, and specialists who know that minutes can mean the difference between walking again or never standing. When Zayden gave his address, the dispatcher already knew where to send him, already mapping the fastest route to a stroke unit. He didn't know it then, but that call set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately save his life. As he waited for the sirens, Zayden fought to stay awake. He whispered his symptoms into the phone, forcing the words out, each one like pushing against a locked door. He told them the time he first noticed the heaviness, repeating it again and again so he wouldn't forget. He remembered me saying once, "The clock is your greatest enemy and your greatest ally." Doctors needed to know when symptoms began, because that single detail could determine whether he was eligible for treatments that dissolve clots. That truth gave him something to hold on to, a reason to keep speaking, to keep fighting, to keep himself present. When the call ended, Zayden was left again in the stillness of his living room. He looked toward the door, imagining the paramedics breaking through if he couldn't open it. Summoning his fading strength, he pulled himself up, shuffled forward, and unlocked it. The sound of the bolt clicking back was strangely comforting, like a promise that help would soon find him. In those moments, Zayden discovered something about himself he had never truly tested: resilience. Alone, frightened, body failing him, he still acted. And those actions, fumbling, imperfect, desperate, were enough. They were enough to ensure the path to help remained open. That is the essence of survival, not perfection, but persistence. Later, when he told me the story in his hospital bed, his voice cracked with emotion. "I almost didn't call," he admitted. "I thought maybe it was nothing. But then I thought of your words, and I knew waiting would be worse." That confession stays with me, because so many never make the call. They convince themselves to endure, to tough it out, and by the time they surrender, it is often too late. Zayden's bravery was not the absence of fear, it was his choice to act despite it. And that, dear one, is the heart of part 2. Survival begins the moment you ask for help. Even if your words stumble, even if your voice is weak, the act of reaching out sets the rescue in motion. Zayden's second shift was from silence to connection, from isolation to reaching outward. It was a simple act, yet it changed the course of his life. The seconds dragged on as Zayden waited, the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall his only companion. He could feel the weakness growing heavier in his arm, his words still stubborn and tangled. Yet he wasn't finished preparing. Survival, he realized, wasn't only about making the call, it was about making sure help could reach him once they arrived. And so, with shaky determination, he began the slow process of readying his home for strangers who would soon rush through the door. He cleared the small rug from the entryway, nudging it aside with his foot to prevent the paramedics from tripping. He reached for the list he kept on the kitchen counter, the one with his medications written out neatly in his daughter's handwriting. Years earlier, she had insisted he keep it updated: blood pressure pills, a low-dose aspirin, and his cholesterol medication. At the time, he thought it unnecessary, but now it was a lifeline. He placed it on the coffee table, easy to see so the paramedics would know what his body was already carrying. This was the third great shift in Zayden's journey, moving from helplessness to preparation. Even while his body betrayed him, he could still clear obstacles, still create a safe path, still ensure that nothing delayed the treatment he desperately needed. He thought of his dog, Milo, asleep in the back room. Summoning his fading strength, he closed the door to keep the animal from bolting or interfering. He knew every minute counted, and even the smallest delay could rob him of recovery. As a doctor, I've seen too many patients lose precious time because responders had to break through locked doors or search for critical information. That's why Zayden's actions mattered so deeply. Each small effort he made, unlocking, clearing, gathering, wasn't just practical, it was heroic. It meant that when help arrived, they could move without hesitation, without guessing, without searching. And when it comes to stroke, hesitation is the enemy. Zayden lowered himself carefully onto the living room floor, closer to the front door, where the paramedics would be most likely to find him. He felt the coolness of the tiles beneath him, grounding him in reality. He switched on the lamp by the window, pulling the curtains open wide. Let them see me, he thought, as though willing his rescuers to spot him faster. Each of these actions was born not of panic, but of quiet clarity. For even in his fear, Zayden chose to prepare, to welcome help, to smooth the path ahead. I imagined him lying there, his breath uneven, his eyes fixed on the front door. And I can't help but admire the determination it must have taken. Too often we underestimate the strength of the human spirit, especially in the elderly. People assume they will collapse, give up, surrender. But Zayden did the opposite. He turned his vulnerability into preparation. He made himself ready for rescue, and in that readiness was a kind of courage greater than words. When the sirens finally wailed in the distance, echoing through the neighborhood streets, Zayden felt a rush of relief wash over him. The sound was no longer frightening, but comforting, the song of help drawing nearer. He whispered to himself, reminding his fading memory of the time his symptoms began. He wanted the doctors to know. He wanted them to have every weapon they could use to fight for him. That night, in his hospital room, Zayden told me about those minutes before the paramedics arrived. His voice trembled, but his eyes held steady. I just kept thinking, make it easy for them. Don't waste their time. Don't make them fight through the mess. It struck me deeply because in that moment of weakness, Zayden had chosen to think of others, of the men and women who would come crashing through his door to save him. And in doing so, he had also saved himself. The truth we often forget is this: in emergencies, preparation is power. Not the grand preparation of plans and speeches, but the simple, ordinary readiness of a door unlocked, a list written, a light turned on. Those things seem small until the moment they mean everything. Zayden's story reminds us that survival isn't always about strength. It's about foresight, even in the face of fear. And so, part 3 closes with another transformation. Zayden had moved from awareness to connection, and now from fear to preparation. He was not waiting idly for fate to decide. He was shaping his own survival, one small action at a time. The house had fallen silent again after the sirens faded closer, but Zayden's heart was still pounding. He lowered himself onto the floor, his body heavy, one side weak and sluggish. He remembered something I had once told him during a checkup. If you're waiting for help during a stroke, how you position yourself matters. Those words came back like a quiet whisper of guidance. He carefully turned onto his side, pulling his weaker arm close to his body while bending the other to support his head. The recovery position felt strange, but he trusted it. Trusted that it would keep his airway clear and his breathing steady. The floor was cold, pressing into his shoulder, but he didn't dare move again. He tilted his head slightly, placing a cushion beneath it. Each small adjustment was deliberate, chosen with what little strength he had left. He loosened his shirt collar and belt, trying to ease the tightness around his chest. A dull ache pounded in his skull, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. Inhale, exhale, counting each breath in his head to keep panic away. This was the fourth great shift in Zayden's story, from mere preparation to active self-preservation. He wasn't just waiting for rescue now, he was shaping his body's chance to endure until the paramedics arrived. And though he was alone, he felt a flicker of control. In moments where life seemed to be slipping from his grasp, he discovered that even small, deliberate choices could hold immense power. As a doctor, I've seen the tragic consequences when patients don't or can't protect themselves while waiting. A sudden fall can turn a stroke into something even deadlier. A glass of water swallowed in desperation can turn into choking. Even the act of sitting upright when too weak can lead to collapse and injury. That's why Zayden's calm decision to lie safely on his side, to avoid eating or drinking, to remain as steady as possible, mattered so much. It bought him time. And in the fight against a stroke, time is everything. Lying there, Zayden's thoughts drifted to his late wife, Clara. He remembered how she used to scold him for working too hard, for skipping meals, for ignoring the warning signs of stress. "Your body talks to you," she would say. "The question is whether you're listening." A faint smile touched his lips, crooked though it was. In a strange way, it felt as though she was with him in that room, urging him to hold on, to keep breathing, to trust that help was on its way. The minutes stretched like hours. His body wanted to surrender, his eyelids heavy, his mind drifting in and out. But Zayden anchored himself with the rhythm of his breathing. "Stay awake," he whispered, "stay awake." He knew that sleep could slide too easily into unconsciousness, and he fought against it, summoning memories of his children, of laughter around the dinner table, of lessons taught in the classroom. Those memories were fuel, keeping him tethered to the present. By the time the paramedics burst through his door, Zayden was still on his side, still breathing evenly, still awake. They knelt beside him, checking his pulse, their voices firm yet gentle. One of them noticed the cushion under his head, the loosened collar, the way he was already in the recovery position. "Smart man," the paramedic muttered, almost to himself. And in that small remark, Zayden felt a quiet pride, a sense that even in his weakest hour, he had done something right. Later, when I visited him in the hospital, he told me about that moment on the floor. I kept thinking, what would you tell me to do? And so I tried to do it. His voice cracked, but his eyes shone with determination. That's what struck me most, the resilience of a man who, even in the shadow of fear, chose to act with clarity. And that's the lesson of part 4. Sometimes survival isn't about big, heroic gestures. It's about the small, deliberate steps you take to protect yourself when the world seems to be slipping away. Zayden's fourth transformation was from fear to self-preservation, from waiting passively to actively keeping himself safe. And because of those choices, when help finally arrived, he was alive, conscious, and ready for the next stage of his journey. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Zayden remembered the flashing lights dancing across the walls of the ambulance, the low hum of voices around him, and the steady rhythm of machines that seemed to breathe on his behalf. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, but his words still tumbled out broken. One of the paramedics leaned close and said gently, "Save your strength, sir. We've got you." For the first time since the stroke began, Zayden allowed himself to close his eyes, not in surrender, but in trust. At the hospital doors, a team was already waiting. They moved quickly, voices overlapping, checking his vitals, asking questions he couldn't fully answer. Yet the details he had whispered earlier, the exact time of his first symptoms, the medications he took, were now being repeated by the paramedics. His earlier efforts had mattered. Those fragments of information traveled with him, like breadcrumbs leading the doctors to the right treatment. The scans confirmed what they suspected, an ischemic stroke, a clot lodged where blood should flow freely. The doctor spoke urgently, explaining that a powerful medication could dissolve the clot, but it had to be given within a strict window of time. Zayden, unable to form words, looked into their eyes and nodded. That nod, though small, was filled with determination. He was choosing to fight. This was the fifth shift in Zayden's story, from survival to treatment, from holding on in silence to placing his trust in others. And here, too, lies a truth worth remembering. Stroke treatments are only possible if you reach help in time. That's why every minute he saved earlier now became precious currency, exchanged for the chance to recover. Hours later, as the medication coursed through his body, Zayden drifted in and out of restless dreams. He saw flashes of Clara's smile, the sound of his daughter's voice, the echo of students raising their hands in his old classroom. He clung to those images, feeling as though they were pulling him forward, urging him not to let go. When he woke again, his speech was still weak, but the crushing heaviness in his arm had eased slightly. It was the first sign of hope. His children arrived the next morning, their faces pale with worry. His son gripped his hand tightly, while his daughter brushed tears from her eyes. "Dad, you scared us," she whispered. Zayden tried to smile, though it came uneven, and managed a few shaky words. "Didn't give up." For them, those words meant more than any doctor's report. They saw not just their father in a hospital bed, but a fighter who had refused to surrender to fear. As his family gathered around him, I explained the reality. Recovery would be a long road. There would be therapy, exercises, frustrations, and setbacks. But thanks to his quick actions, the damage was far less than it might have been. "You bought yourself time," I told him, "and that time gave you a second chance." That phrase, second chance, seemed to settle deep within him. Zayden had always been a teacher, a guide for others. Now he saw his own experience as a lesson, not just for his family, but for anyone willing to listen. He had faced death in the silence of his own home, and yet he had emerged, not whole, but alive. And being alive meant there was still work to do. When I think of Part 5, I think of the quiet shift from panic to hope, from chaos to clarity. Zayden's story teaches us that survival doesn't end when the paramedics arrive. It continues in the choices you make at the hospital, in the trust you place in doctors, in the faith you carry even when your body is weak. His fifth transformation was not just physical, it was emotional. He had crossed the bridge from fear into resilience, guided by the hands of others, yet strengthened by his own will to live. The days after Zayden's stroke were not easy. The hospital walls seemed to close in on him at times, and every movement felt heavier than it once had. A fork slipping from his hand, a word refusing to come when he needed it, these small defeats carried weight. But in each of them, Zayden also saw a quiet challenge. He had spent a lifetime teaching others to push through difficulty, to search for meaning in struggle, and now those lessons circled back to him. He would have to live them, not just preach them. The therapist came each morning, guiding him through slow exercises. At first, lifting his arm felt like dragging a stone uphill. Speaking a single sentence was exhausting. Yet little by little, progress emerged. A stronger grip one day, a clearer word the next. His daughter sat by his side during those sessions, cheering softly, her encouragement flowing into him like a second heartbeat. "You're getting there, Dad," she said one morning, her smile trembling with pride. And though his body ached, those words reminded him that healing wasn't just his fight, it was theirs, together. This was Zayden's sixth transformation, from patient to participant in his own recovery. He was no longer just the man who had survived alone in his living room, he was now someone shaping the future with intention. And here too lies a health truth worth remembering. The brain, remarkable in its plasticity, can rebuild. Pathways can be retrained, skills relearned, strength regained. It requires persistence, patience, and the willingness to endure frustration. But recovery is possible. Zayden embodied that possibility. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. Late at night, as the machines hummed and shadows lengthened across the hospital floor, he wondered whether life would ever feel normal again. Would he walk his dog, Milo, down the block like he used to? Would he stand in front of his old classroom, even if only to volunteer, and feel the satisfaction of guiding others? The questions lingered like ghosts, yet in those quiet hours he remembered what had brought him this far, not certainty, but the refusal to surrender. He had chosen to act when everything told him to wait. He had chosen to prepare, to endure, to trust. And so he chose once again to believe that healing was within reach. When his children visited, they noticed the difference. His smile, though still uneven, was stronger. His voice, though halting, carried more weight. They brought him books, puzzles, and old photos to stir his memory and spark conversation. Each small victory they witnessed became fuel for their hope. And Zayden, seeing their joy, realized that recovery was not just for himself, it was for them too. For the family who needed him, for the memories still waiting to be made. As I sat by his bedside, I reminded him gently, the best way to survive a stroke is to prevent the next one. Together, we spoke of new habits, measuring blood pressure daily, limiting salt, walking a little each morning, finding calm in breathing exercises. None of it felt glamorous, but it wasn't meant to. It was meant to be sustainable, a way of living that honored the gift of his second chance. He listened quietly, nodding, his eyes reflecting both weariness and determination. By the time Zayden left the hospital, he was not the same man who had stumbled with a teacup in his hand days earlier. He walked slowly, carefully, with a cane by his side, but he walked. His children flanked him, their hands ready to steady him if needed, their eyes glistening with gratitude. The sunlight greeted him outside the hospital doors, warm on his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it in. It was not the end of his journey, but a continuation, one he would now approach with reverence, humility, and a renewed sense of purpose. Part 6 is not just the closing of Zayden's first chapter, it is the reminder that survival is not a moment, but a process. It is the countless decisions, both large and small, that build a bridge from fear to resilience, from despair to hope. And perhaps the greatest truth of all is this: a stroke may change the body, but it does not have to steal the spirit. Zayden's story is proof. Zayden's journey began in silence, a man alone in his living room as his body betrayed him. In those terrifying minutes, he faced a choice between denial and action. His first transformation was the courage to recognize the truth that he was having a stroke and to act quickly instead of waiting. That single decision gave him a chance at survival. His second transformation came later in the hospital, when he shifted from simply enduring to actively rebuilding. With each exercise, each halting word, he chose resilience over despair, proving that recovery is not only possible, but worth fighting for. When we look at his story, it is more than a medical event. It is a mirror. Any of us could be in Zayden's place, alone, frightened, unsure. His courage reminds us that survival often comes down to awareness and the willingness to act, even when fear tells us to stay still. It also reminds us that prevention is just as important. Managing blood pressure, caring for our bodies, and staying connected with others are small steps that build a safer future. So tonight, as you reflect on Zayden's journey, ask yourself, if faced with the same silence, the same sudden weakness, would you know what to do? Would you choose to listen to your body, to call for help, to fight for another tomorrow? Because in the end, Zayden's story is not just about surviving a stroke. It is about reclaiming life, one decision at a time. His second chance is a reminder for all of us. No matter the fear, no matter the struggle, there is always hope when we choose to act. And perhaps the greatest truth is this: every heartbeat is an invitation to keep living fully, and every tomorrow is a gift waiting to be claimed.